The Conjuring House controversy. The famous home and its owners have been in hot water after the town did not renew the business entertainment license last month.
For decades, it was the stuff of nightmares. A farmhouse in Rhode Island where whispers turned to screams and unseen forces shattered a family's peace. The world came to know it as the Conjuring House. Ghost hunters chased its secrets. Hollywood twisted its horrors. But behind the fog of folklore, something darker waited to be uncovered. At last, the mystery has been unraveled. And the truth? It's far more unsettling than anyone expected. This isn't just a ghost story. This is about trauma that lingers, lives, that unraveled, and a force that may never have left. The haunting didn't end. It evolved. And the real horror? It may have never been supernatural at all. A land stained by tragedy. Long before Hollywood ever rolled cameras on The Conjuring, the land known as the Old Arnold Estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island, had already earned a grim reputation. The colonial-era farmhouse, built around 1736, stood for centuries as a silent witness to generations of tragedy. Documented deaths on or near the property include multiple deaths by self-inflicted hanging, several drownings, a poisoning, and the deaths of 4 men who reportedly froze to death. One particularly unsettling case involved Mrs. John Arnold, who allegedly hanged herself in the barn at age 93. These events, while historically recorded, created an air of dread around the estate, fueling suspicions that the land itself might be cursed. The estate was home to 8 generations of the Arnold family, making it a deeply rooted part of local history. However, much of the terror tied to the property stems not just from official records, but from a long tradition of oral storytelling. As tales were passed down and retold, often without context or confirmation, they blurred the line between fact and folklore. Skeptics argue that the so-called pattern of misfortune may be coincidental or exaggerated over time. Still, for believers and paranormal enthusiasts, the volume and consistency of these accounts lend credence to something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Perhaps the most enduring legend linked with the estate is that of Prudence Arnold, an 11-year-old girl who was allegedly indecently assaulted and slain by a farmhand. Historical record shows that there was a terrible crime, yet it took place in the nearby town of Uxbridge, Massachusetts, and not on the Arnold property. Nevertheless, this story has been falsely and repeatedly attributed to the farmhouse, thus solidifying its place in the annals of local lore. The distortion becomes classic in how calamity elsewhere can become assimilated into the ambiance of an allegedly haunted space, particularly when fear and imagination begin to fill the voids. Another name forever entwined with the estate is Bathsheba Sherman, a 19th-century woman who was accused, without trial, of witchcraft and infanticide. Though she lived in the vicinity, not on the Arnold estate itself, she was thought to have cursed the land and sacrificed her own child to Satan. Far-fetched, these allegations, ungrounded in verifiable evidence, were instigated by suspicion within the community and magnified by the Conjuring film. Bathsheba's story evolved over the years into perhaps the most notorious ghost story of the estate. Legend, perhaps more than woman. That tale encapsulates wider dynamics at play. A place so stained in real tragedy became the perfect breeding ground for folklore, suspicion, and fears of the supernatural. While the land's past was already drenched in sorrow and suspicion, the Perons family's arrival would awaken something that had long been waiting in silence. Whispers begin. In January 1971, Roger and Carolyn Perons, along with their 5 daughters, moved into the old Arnold estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island. Enchanted by its colonial charm and expansive 8.5-acre landscape, the family saw the centuries-old farmhouse as the perfect escape to a quieter, simpler life. With its 14 rooms and rustic details, the property seemed like a dream come true. However, almost immediately after settling in, that dream began to unravel. What initially appeared to be quirks of an old house quickly took on an unsettling tone. The first signs were subtle but persistent. Household items and tools began disappearing, only to reappear in unusual places. Carolyn noticed her broom constantly shifting locations, and dirt piles would mysteriously form in freshly cleaned rooms. These odd disturbances didn't seem threatening at first, but they broke the family's sense of normalcy and hinted at something unseen meddling with their daily routines. Rational explanations, drafts, forgetfulness, or the house settling quickly wore thin as the activity became more frequent and inexplicable. But even more, the mannerisms of the dog were disturbing for the family. Brevardu, who was supposed to be the courageous kind, had suddenly started showing a fiery temper while growling at empty corners of the house. He refused to enter in certain rooms, and particularly near the cellar. Animals are generally said to have a sensitivity that exceeds human perception. Their fear, which was entirely uncharacteristic, only increased the growing fears of the Perons. It was no longer strange. The house had become aware of them, watching them, loosening itself and now asserting itself. Days turn into weeks. It becomes increasingly clear that something unnatural is at work in the home. The kids whisper about hearing voices, seeing shadows, or catching their toys moving on their own power. Andrea, the oldest, recalled feeling something in the weight in the air at night, like an unseen presence wrapping around her. Doors creaked open when no one was there, footsteps echoed through empty halls, and that once charming house began to feel stifling. What initially struck the Perons as coincidence would soon reveal itself to be just the beginning of a haunting that would define their lives for years to come. A false sense of peace. In the early weeks after moving into the old Arnold estate, the Peron family encountered what seemed to be gentle, almost comforting supernatural presences. These early experiences stood in stark contrast to the terror that would come later. The 5 Peron daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, began to speak of invisible caretakers in the house. These entities were not aggressive or frightening at first. Instead, they seemed to act like watchful guardians, especially around the children. Objects were moved, not thrown or broken, but gently placed elsewhere, as if in play or routine. Doors creaked open by themselves, and whispers echoed through rooms, not with menace, but with curiosity. Cindy Peron, one of the younger daughters, frequently reported feeling tucked into bed at night. At first, she assumed it was her mother, until she noticed a strange, sweet scent lingering in the air, something floral and unfamiliar. Andrea Peron, the eldest, later recalled that these spirits seemed to operate out of habit or affection, not hostility. One entity in particular was said to give goodnight kisses and reposition blankets, as though tending to the children like a doting nursemaid. These encounters created a bizarre sense of calm, even familiarity, within the otherwise creaky and mysterious house. To the Perons, it started feeling as if they were sharing the space with the remnants of the past by former occupants who never left, but not unfriendly. The children learned to adapt about these nice spirits. They talked occasionally about them like they were extended family. The idiosyncrasies of this home, such as toys appearing and disappearing at will, doors opening by themselves, have taken on a peculiar sort of familiar domestic cadence. This phase in haunting was more about adjustment to life with phenomenon rather than fear. Yet it only left the family under delusion because of the benign spirits stretched over them. This transitory tranquility may have been the most hazardous delusion of all. Eventually, the warmth of these spirits started to withdraw, replaced with something much colder and more invasive. Andrea would eventually insinuate that these icons of gentleness had either been dethroned or overwhelmed, perhaps, by something far more sinister. All that the family once deemed a quiet cohabitation had turned into a fast-growing menace. And now, the former starry-eyed gentleness seemed like it might well have just been the calm leading to a very long and very violent storm, foreshadowing nothing less than the first chapter of a story much more nightmarish than any of them had imagined. Cindy's chilling confession. One of the most haunting moments during the Perron family's time in the old Arnold estate came from an unsettling revelation by young Cindy Peron. Amid the mounting strangeness already gripping the household, Cindy confided in her older sister Andrea that she had heard whispers, clear and unrelenting, that said, "7 dead soldiers are buried in the walls." The message was not vague or dreamlike. It was distinct, eerie, and deeply specific. Unlike previous oddities, this statement felt deliberate, as though a voice from beyond wanted its truth acknowledged. The idea that human remains could be hidden within the home's very structure cast a new, chilling shadow over the family's understanding of the haunting. The emotional toll on Cindy was immediate and profound. Already sensitive to the supernatural disturbances in the house, she began to withdraw, gripped by anxiety and fear. Nights became unbearable as Cindy lay awake, imagining skeletons within the walls, their spirits watching her every move. Her growing distress also disturbed her siblings, who noticed her agitation and began to internalize her fears. The Peron parents tried to console their daughter, but even they could not shake the creeping sense that something ancient and deeply wrong had taken root in their home. However terrifying Cindy's disclosure, it was not supported by physical evidence of buried soldiers. There were records, bones, or both architectural anomalies to substantiate such claims. The power of the statement, however, never faded, and the idea became deeply rooted in the family psyche, adding to the most iconic and eerie parts of their experience. In later years, it found a place among the accounts of paranormal investigators and storytellers as an important element in the house's haunted legend. Even skeptics agree that its psychological effect is what assigns the statement its worth, whether or not it was literarily true. However, beyond the legends of the 7 soldiers, the account of the Peron family brought it into a larger folk tradition regarding the Conjuring House. With the colonial pasts of Rhode Island and its proximity to old wars, it gave just enough reality to the story, an imagination that could haunt. To this day, visitors and paranormal enthusiasts grapple with the idea. If in fact the house conceals the bones of long-forgotten souls, could the disturbance they left be the cause of the shadows within? There are no bones found, but the whisper lingers, faint but unforgettable. The woman behind the witch. Bathsheba Sherman, born Bathsheba Thayer in 1812, has become one of the most infamous and misunderstood figures linked to the Conjuring House legend. Her name is now synonymous with evil, thanks to her terrifying portrayal in the 2013 film The Conjuring, where she was depicted as a sadistic witch who sacrificed her child to Satan and cursed the land before taking her own life. However, this version of Bathsheba stems largely from folklore and cinematic dramatization, not historical fact. In reality, she was a 19th-century Rhode Island farmer's wife who lived on a property near, but not directly on, the old Arnold estate. Rumors of witchcraft and child-slaying surrounding Bathsheba began during her lifetime, largely fueled by the suspicious death of an infant in her care. According to local legend, the child died from a puncture wound at the base of the skull, which led to whispers that she had used a sewing needle in a ritual sacrifice. While the incident drew suspicion from neighbors, no formal charges were ever brought against her. Nevertheless, Bathsheba became a social pariah, viewed with mistrust and fear by a deeply superstitious community. Her reputation as a malevolent figure grew after her death in 1885, particularly through retellings that blurred the lines between rumor and reality. Unlike her Hollywood counterpart, the true Bathsheba led a life of tragedy and rather normalcy befitting those days. She got married to Judson Sherman, and from that union bore a few children, but unfortunately, not all survived infancy, an all-too-common fate in the 1800s. There is no evidence whatsoever that witchcraft, satanic practices, or criminal wrongdoing could be directly attributed to her. Most of this so-called witch status arises after her death, probably from local superstition and morbid curiosity. The story continued to darken with the passage of years, eventually culminating in this fictionalized representation that has now eclipsed the truth. Bathsheba, as portrayed in The Conjuring, becomes less a woman than an emblem of evil, as a symbol cast to heighten the horror narrative. It is compelling for the cinema, but much too unfair to the real-life figure that actually had a story laden with suspicion, sadness, and probably injustice. Historians and local researchers have tirelessly worked at correcting the record that links Bathsheba to the Arnold estate, an association that at best remains tenuous. Well, in spite of all facts, ghost stories and supernatural lore would often take precedence over fear. In the case of Bathsheba, it is a legend that could linger way beyond the truth. Bathsheba Sherman's legend was shaped by whispers of the past. Carolyn Perons would come to believe that the spirit of that very woman had stepped out of folklore and into her life. Carolyn Perons' ordeal. As the strange events at the old Arnold estate intensified, Carolyn Perons, the matriarch of the Perons family, began to experience the most disturbing and personal manifestations of the haunting. What began as minor inconveniences, such as misplaced objects and sudden drafts, escalated into alarming physical symptoms. Carolyn frequently awoke with unexplained bruises on her body, often in places she couldn't have reached, or injured herself during sleep. Her energy began to deteriorate rapidly, and she often complained of being watched, especially in the bedroom and around the cellar. Over time, her health declined in ways that puzzled and frightened her family, raising questions about whether something in the house was directly affecting her. The most terrifying element of Carolyn's ordeal was her repeated claim of encountering a spectral woman who would appear by her bed, glaring with hatred and whispering threats. Carolyn became convinced that this entity, believed by some to be the spirit of Bathsheba Sherman, was not just haunting the house, but targeting her specifically. These nighttime visitations grew more intense and violent in nature, leading Carolyn to fear not only for her sanity, but for her life. Unlike the other family members who had mostly generalized encounters, Carolyn's experiences seemed focused, deliberate, and increasingly malicious. The experience started weighing heavily on Carolyn's mind and emotions. She became standoffish, often appearing distracted or jumpy. She was depressed and fatigued. The changes in her personality by now were subtle, yet they were grotesquely real. Roger's concern now deepened, especially as the rest of the family began to sense the weight and dread emanating from her. It was not just a haunting, it seemed to be a siege. And Carolyn seemed to stand at the vanguard of a battle that no one fully understood. She was the center of a dark energy, almost like one which fed on her fear and fatigue. Roger, in a desperate measure, called upon Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were well-known paranormal investigators, in the hopes of finding the answers they sought. Lorraine sensed that an extremely powerful malevolent force was targeting Carolyn. She warned that this spirit was not only inhabiting the house, it was attempting to possess or destroy her. This was the revelation that led to one of the most notorious occasions in the Perons haunting. The seance meant to confront the entity. Instead, all it did was amplify the chaos. For Carolyn Perons, the haunting was never an abstract horror. It was an extremely personal assault, physical, psychological, and invisible, a true onslaught leaving scars long after the family fled the house. The seance that shouldn't have happened. When the Perons family's distress reached its peak, Roger Perons turned to renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren for help. Known for their involvement in high-profile hauntings, the Warrens were no strangers to spiritual warfare. Lorraine, a clairvoyant and self-described medium, immediately sensed a dark, oppressive presence in the old Arnold estate. One she claimed was directly attached to Carolyn Perons. While the family had hoped for guidance and relief, the Warrens proposed a controversial next step: conducting a seance to confront and expel the entity. Despite Roger's hesitation, the growing threat to Carolyn's well-being left the family desperate for answers. The seance was held in the farmhouse's basement, a location already steeped in fear due to earlier disturbances. What was meant to be a controlled spiritual intervention quickly spiraled into chaos. Andrea Perons, the eldest daughter, disobeyed her parents' instructions to stay upstairs and secretly watched the ritual unfold. According to her first-hand account, the moment Lorraine began communicating with the spirit world, Carolyn reacted violently. Her demeanor shifted, her voice contorted into something inhuman, and she began speaking in a language no one recognized. The climax came when Carolyn's chair reportedly lifted off the ground and hurled her across the room with unnatural force. Roger Perons had a horrifying scene before his eyes. He commanded the Warrens to leave as he thought that their coming had worsened the matter than leaving it at that. That event left the family shocked and shaken up. Carolyn suffered injuries along with mental disbalance. Simultaneously, Lorraine Warren affirmed sensing something very evil during the seance, but rarely spoke anything about it. So her silence added to the speculations and made it more mysterious and suspicious about the event, fueling the imagination that even the Warrens couldn't fully understand or control it. The house began to change somehow with whatever had been unleashed or provoked that day in the seance. Later events broke slightly, though it seemed psychologically the most traumatic. Andrea Perons described the seance as the moment that forever sealed her conviction that this entity in the house was real and dangerous. Critics argue that it was irresponsible, even slightly exploitative, but at this point in time, for the Perons, it was a desperate measure against constant fear. Instead of closure, this becomes one of the most chilling and discussed chapters in the long, terrifying history of the Conjuring House. The real hide and clap incident. Among the many strange and unsettling events that plagued the Perons family, one incident stands out for its disturbing blend of childlike innocence and calculated menace. During an ordinary game of hide-and-seek, young Cindy Perons chose to hide inside an old wooden pine box stored in the family's barn. The box had no visible lock or latch and appeared safe, at least at first glance. But once she climbed inside, the lid inexplicably slammed shut and refused to open. No amount of pushing, banging, or yelling from within could release her. For nearly 20 minutes, she was trapped in the suffocating darkness, terrified and alone, until her sister Nancy finally found her and opened the box with ease, without encountering any resistance. To the family, the incident was more than a frightening childhood mishap. There was no mechanical reason the box should have sealed itself shut, and Cindy was adamant she hadn't closed it fully to begin with. What disturbed them most was the complete silence during those long minutes. No one had heard her cries. In a house already charged with unexplainable noises, cold drafts, and moving objects, this moment felt cruelly deliberate. It was as though something within the home had chosen to isolate and frighten Cindy, turning an innocent game into a psychological trap. The family began to suspect that whatever haunted the house wasn't just present. It was intelligent, manipulative, and disturbingly aware of the children's actions. The episode is so terrifying that it inspired the creation of one more iconic scene in The Conjuring, the famous hide and clap trick. In the film, a mother is lured into the basement by disembodied clapping hands during a game of blindfolded hide-and-seek, only to be terrorized by an unseen force. The events in the movie were greatly dramatized for effect. They were rooted in the very real fear that the Perons family felt during Cindy's entrapment. The film captured the sense that the family believed the house itself was playing games with them, blurring the line between childish fun and supernatural malice. For the children of the Perons family, this event greatly altered their perception of the home. Games were now unsafe, and things considered safe had taken on an air of menace. Cindy's trauma from it only reinforced the idea that the house was not haunted, but hostile, being able to isolate and endanger them at will. Even given all the skeptics who attribute other events of the house to coincidences or groupthink, this event is one which mocks all such explanations. Although the hide and clap scene was enjoyable for the audience, it was a brutal reminder for the Perons of how thin the division between what is real and what is horror actually is. Life after the house. Even after the Perron family left the old Arnold estate in 1980, the haunting didn't seem to end. Though they had finally escaped the physical confines of the house, the emotional and psychological weight of their experiences followed them. Over the years, Andrea Peron and her sisters reported continued paranormal disturbances, unseen forces, moving objects, sudden cold spots in rooms, strange dreams, and an overwhelming sensation of being watched. For them, the presence they had encountered in Harrisville wasn't tied solely to the location. It had become part of their lives, lingering like a shadow that refused to fade with distance or time. One of the most unsettling post-move events occurred during the production of The Conjuring in 2012. While Andrea and some of her sisters visited the film set in North Carolina, a sudden and violent gust of wind struck, toppling lighting equipment and halting production, despite calm weather conditions. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles away in Georgia, Carolyn Peron, who had chosen not to travel, suffered a serious fall and broke her hip. The timing was too eerie to ignore. When Carolyn later heard about the chaos on set, she reportedly whispered, "Bathsheba does not want to be exposed." The incident left the family rattled and reinforced their belief that whatever force had haunted them was still active. Those experiences also lend credence to a theory propounded by some parapsychologists. Hauntings might be taken by individuals rather than locations. For some, these events are better known as post-traumatic hauntings or residual attachments. They suggest that very strong emotions and resistances to intense or prolonged exposure to supernatural forces would often bear imprints that last on people psychologically and energetically. With the Perons, it could really be a case of too much exposure for too long to that kind of phenomenon in an obvious structure to have altered them permanently, if not mentally, at least spiritually. As Dr. Barry Taff once remarked, sometimes it's not the house that's haunted, it's the people. A haunting, therefore, seemed not to have been the end of a chapter for the Perons, but rather more be like their lives would have to accommodate for them going onward. Still today, Andrea Peron publicly discusses the haunting and what its long-term effects were. She notes not just the horrors of the events themselves, but also some of the emotional scars that they left behind in her interviews and her memoir series, House of Darkness, House of Light. This basically reminds one that supernatural encounters, real or merely perceived, can have really deep psychological consequences. Though the spirits really could have followed them or the trauma that the experience had imprinted into their lives, one thing is assured. For the Peron family, the haunting did not stay confined within the walls of the Conjuring House. It followed them into every chapter that came after. From Norma to paranormal tourism. After the Peron family left the old Arnold estate, the house entered a quieter period, at least publicly. In 1987, Norma Sutcliffe and her husband Jerry Helfrich purchased the property, unaware of its growing infamy. For years, they lived in relative peace, enjoying the historic charm and rural serenity the farmhouse offered. But all that changed in 2013 with the release of The Conjuring. Practically overnight, the home became a magnet for ghost hunters, horror fans, and thrill seekers. Strangers trespassed at night, fans knocked on the door at all hours, and the once private residence became a public obsession. The haunting had evolved, no longer confined to supernatural fears, but now fed by modern media and pop culture. Although Norma Sutcliffe initially dismissed the idea of the house being haunted, she did report experiencing a few unusual phenomena, such as unexplained footsteps, flickering lights, and disembodied voices. Still, she approached these events with skepticism, attributing them to the natural creaks and groans of a centuries-old home. Concerned more about the real-world dangers of unwanted attention, she filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers for using the likeness of her home without consent. Her case highlighted the unforeseen consequences of horror-based storytelling, where the blending of fact and fiction created real intrusions on private lives. The house's next owners, Corey and Jennifer Heinzen, rather unlike Sutcliffe, embraced the place's haunted legend to the fullest. The Heinzen couple, being paranormal investigators, purchased the property in 2019, intending to open it up to the public. Overnight experiences, ghost tours, and live investigations were held as the couple capitalized on the reputation of the house as a site of paranormal activity. While doors opening by themselves and strange noises were just some of the odd happenings they experienced themselves, they promoted it as a place where guests could directly absorb the mystery. This was a point of transformation for the Conjuring House. No longer a private residence, but quickly spinning into one of commercialized interest for the supernatural. Paranormal tourism has surged in recent years, with places like the Conjuring House turning into immersive attractions blending history, folklore, and entertainment. Documentaries like The Sleepless Unrest added to the intrigue, with filmmakers describing an eerie heaviness in the air. For many, the fear feels as psychological as it is paranormal. Once tied to family trauma and whispered legends, the house now stands at the intersection of myth and modern tourism, proof that some hauntings don't fade, they just evolve. Just as the Conjuring House reached the height of its eerie fame, a series of quiet decisions behind closed doors would bring the spectacle to an unexpected and unsettling end. Closure of the Conjuring House. In November 2024, the Conjuring House's run as a paranormal hotspot came to an abrupt stop when Rhode Island's Department of Labor and Training issued a stop work order. The owners had failed to maintain workers' compensation insurance since May, raising red flags about legal compliance and safety, especially at a site known for its eerie allure and high visitor volume. Soon after, the Burrillville Town Council voted not to renew the house's entertainment license, effectively halting all public tours, events, and overnight investigations. While the attraction had boosted tourism, it also stirred complaints about noise, trespassing, and public disruption. Local officials cited both regulatory concerns and growing community pushback in their decision. In December last year, the Conjuring House finally closed its door from the outside world. It was a chapter that cinematically blended ghost stories, popular tales, and tourism. The house is still privately owned, and its future is still unknown. Some locals are really glad about this change. Others, however, mourned the loss of an odd but beloved attraction. Meanwhile, the legacy continues. Fans keep circulating footage, stories, and theories about the place online. Some dismissing it and calling it ordinary. Others regarding it as something more mysterious. The house sits silent today, but remains, undoubtedly, among the most potent symbols in American folklore, where fact, fiction, and fear still blur the lines. The mystery may be solved, but the echoes of what happened in that house still linger. And maybe, just maybe, they always will. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't vanish just yet. Hit like to keep the light on, drop a comment with your theories, and subscribe for more real-life nightmares from history's darkest corners. And if you're brave enough, click the next video. Something's waiting for you there.